Hi, I just wanted to do a quick video on a topic I've been discussing a lot in the office, and I also on Facebook and in general. I want to talk about being forgivable. Why I just this was such a huge part of my healing, and was what I truly believe why I healed so quickly, so instantly from a very severe suicidal psychological illness. Take these off. I go back and I believe that a huge part of my process was in the act of having compassion, not only for myself and my circumstance and how incredibly insane I was, having compassion for that insanity, but also towards, how I got there, towards my parents and my family and towards my upbringing, and also having compassion for my rapes. Yes, there are more than one circumstance there, and my rapists. I had to really forgive to move forward, and not have any ounce of those memories really affect me in a negative way. And in doing so, in that process, I've gone back to think what this took, and it really took a lot of understanding and being willing to understand where I believe, why I ended up the way I did. If I look back at my upbringing, I was raised part of the issue I do believe is in how, some of the stuff I was taught in the application of it. I was taught, I was always taught I was raised Christian. I was always taught that you are forgiven, that's always discussed, and to me that was such an incredible, when I was studying the New Testament, God, that there was so much connection to, for me, the atonement, and how the humility of the atonement, as if you're a Christian and understand the story, or not Christian and understand the story. This isn't a preaching. It's really just the observation of my own process. Because I'm not saying this is better than or less than. This is not a religious preach. Just FYI. But I was, taught that through the atonement, when Jesus Christ died, or basically bled from every pore in the Garden of Gethsemane, he essentially forgave all sins. All sins he forgave, which were ultimately, to forgive, you have to have compassion for all sin. And that is so amazing when I look back at that, because that is so true, and that is such a truth of my own experience. Having compassion for my rapists, and how can I see them from a view of compassion, and the ability to be with them and see through their eyes, to understand their behavior, and to still love them. That I cannot tell you that was such a huge part of that process, but also going into my history and understanding why I became such an extremist, which is why I ended up insane. So, I look at my upbringing. Not only was I taught forgiveness, but what really conflicted with that was this teaching of, commission or omission, sin through omission or sin through commission. Meaning, if you don't know something's a sin or something's wrong, you're not held to it because you don't understand it. Whereas if you are taught a belief, an understanding, this behavior is a sin, once you are taught it, you are now held to the strict standard of it. So if you are taught that premarital sex is a deadly sin, if more sexual sin is close to murder, if you are taught that, then if you breach that rule, there is no forgiveness. So it was very conflicting, as far as like, once you're aware that something is wrong and you do it anyways, it is unforgivable. You are held to a very different standard than someone who doesn't know it's wrong. They're forgiven. Does that make sense? So it was very confusing. So even though I was taught about the atonement and taught about the grace of Jesus Christ and all of that, I was taught also that, well, now that you know, you're held to a different standard. And I'm not saying that this is what everybody's taught. This is just, and how I interpret it, which makes sense. But you have to understand, my father and mother are amazing. I love them so much. They did an incredible, incredible job. But I have so much more understanding of them as people, not as parents. And, my father was raised, my grandfather, my father's father was an alcoholic, and he was also very abusive physically. He beat the shit out of my dad and his brothers. He was physically abused. And to do that, you have to understand what that requires. There's a ton of strict rules, very strict, enough that you could get beat up over nothing, and that just is a reflection of how insane my grandfather was. And I have so much compassion for him, even though I don't even know him. And so, my father's belief systems were very strict, very extreme. That's what he was taught. On top of the fact that when he went to Vietnam, he was traumatized. So you take trauma and childhood trauma, and you're going to have compensation. The compensation is going to be control. And in order for you to control for that type of trauma, it requires rules and strict rules. And my parents gravitated towards religion. So I was raised with very extreme application to religious rule. There was very little forgiveness. And not only was I taught it, but I heard it. I heard there's a lot of judgment in that. And it makes sense to me now why I took on my experience with, premarital sex. It was so defining. It was so awful. I was such a bad person because I knew, and I still did it. It was almost unforgivable. And then when I went through my rape circumstances, it was so traumatic because of how unforgiving I was to those, those belief systems. There was no forgiveness in the belief system. So I had to compensate to just feel better about myself. And one way that I compensated for all of that shame, all of that guilt and feelings of failure, was to try to control my food and my body. And I took my beliefs with food and I applied the same standard. I applied the same unforgiving standard to my food. The 1,200, the calories, using calories, it was so indoctrinated. 1,200 calories is my standard. And if I breached that 1,200 calories, I felt as if I had sinned. I literally took on the same belief application, the insanity, the extremism of it. So without having any forgiveness, and without forgiveness, I was doomed to have massive guilt. And I was doomed to then binge because I felt so bad about it. And then to then have repent for those food sins, I had to find a way to get rid of it. And that's where the extremism through the exercise. I had to exercise to the extreme of my guilt. It didn't even match what I had eaten. It was I had to exercise to the guilt component to what I was eating. So 2 hours and a certain amount of massive physical fatigue would then make me feel like I could start over. And ultimately, when I gave this up, I remember, in my mind when I was ready to give up my beliefs around food and exercise, that ultimately I was going to have to accept the vulnerability of that body image being gone. And the vulnerability was a body that was 600 pounds. because that was my fear, and in doing so, could I forgive 600 pounds? Could I have compassion for myself if I was 600 pounds? This would be like forgiving my rapists. Could I forgive rape as a forgivable sin? And I did. So I had to forgive then the idea that my body is forgivable and my food is forgivable. Can I forgive myself? Is it all or nothing? Is there grace involved in my decisions? And it was so healing. It was so healing to accept 600 pounds. I can't even describe it. It was almost like I couldn't wait to start over. I just couldn't wait, and I just didn't even care anymore, because to me that wasn't a sin anymore. The idea that I had to have the perfect body was where I went wrong, and moralizing that and then applying it to this, like, I have to maintain it now that I know about health and I know about food. I have to live it as if it's morally a belief system, as if I have a soda, which I don't like soda, but if I had full sugar soda, which I intellectually understand, is there grace with that? Should I feel bad about myself? Is there no forgiveness in it? And then to treat my kids as if there's no forgiveness in that, like I'm criticizing them. That constant criticism makes you feel like there is no grace and there is no forgiveness. And many of us have lived that, like there is no compassion. And then we judge others to that same standard. We become very harshly judgmental to other people, because how dare they, put that in their body as if it's a sin. And then the standard, it's just, and no wonder we have guilt when we do it ourselves. No wonder we feel shame, because we feel like such a failure. We can't live up to the standard that we've created and that we've decided we're going to apply without forgiveness. So the question I want you to ask yourself is, what is not forgivable? Is there anything that's not forgivable? Is there truly grace? And if everything is forgivable, does that change your stringency to your belief system? And what were to happen if your stringency is wrong? Maybe that's where things are going wrong. Ultimately, by allowing myself to forgive all that I had judged of myself, of my abusers, of my circumstance, by forgiving that, it allowed me to really open my mind to change my beliefs. To change my beliefs about myself, about my body, about my food, about how I want to apply, my life with moral application. Can I open my mind and my heart to love other people unconditionally without imposing my strict belief system on them as if they have to be lived to the same strict standard? It's almost like, if you're a Christian and you believe in this stuff, it's like saying, can you see through the eyes of what Christ saw? Can you not just memorize it, but actually apply it? And what happens? What happens if you have compassion for all sin? Is there truly a belief system involved then? Is there conformity then? Do we need to conform if there is so much grace and so much compassion from someone that is so incredibly amazing? Sorry. That you can start over and love yourself unconditionally. It's so powerful. It changed my life. To do it for myself.